performing on the sitar. I believe that was Rod Gawathe. So let's begin. Thank you all for coming. For those of you who are joining again from last week, thank you for coming again, and thank you for all the people who have joined new. A few things before I begin. This is a 1.5 hour session, and I will try and keep my lectures short and very concise because I do want this to be a session, more of a discussion session. What the lectures will do is, capture some of the most important and salient points in the readings that were provided. We had 2 for this week, and the two overlap to a great extent, but also diverge in their treatment of decolonization. So today we're reading Frantz Fanon and Paulo Freire. Both write about violence, and more specifically colonial violence. Both agree on many counts as to what the nature of violence is. There are also some similarities in background that we can talk about that are quite interesting between the two. However, they somewhat diverge on their accounts of what a decolonizing move is, right, and what to do about colonial violence, which is something that which is the reason why I put the two together today. So I'd really like for us to kind of have this main points, and then we can open it up. Both Fanon and Freire have a lot to say about undoing violence, about education, about the psychology of because everyone can hear everyone here. If you'd like to speak, and when I open it up, I'll kind of be playing the role of moderator there, and from time to time, kind of like, giving my own sort of 2 takes on it. But if you'd like to speak, you'll see that there's an emoticon in the panel, in the participants panel below that, where you can raise your hand. So if you raise your hand, or if you have your video on, you raise your hand, I can then call on you, and you can unmute and say what you have to say. So we just want to keep this very respectful and very kind, and allow everyone a chance to be heard, and to say their to say what they need to say. So that's all. I am now going to share. So if anyone joining in, please have yourselves on mute. So I'll begin. I'll just share my screen here. And a co-host, if you could help out, because we have people joining in all the time, dropping in. If you could help with admitting them, let me know if there's any trouble there. Okay, so let's begin. Everyone can see? Yes. Okay, great. All right. So let's start. By the way, the photograph this time, on the front page is taken from an amazing movie which if you haven't seen, you should watch, called The Battle of Algiers. It's a sort of brilliant sort of coverage. It covers the sort of French-Algerian War, the Algerian War for independence from France. Which started in 1954. To give a little bit of background on who Fanon, I'm going to talk a little bit about these 2 thinkers and their kind of background, because I think it's particularly important to kind of read their particular sort of readings of coloniality and colonization, and their particular takes on decolonization in the light of the kinds of experiences that they had. This is just something that I think is a really good idea to do, when exploring the oeuvre or the work of a thinker, right? To kind of unravel or unveil where their thought kind of emerges from. So Fanon was, is known as he practiced as a psychiatrist, and he practiced psychiatry in France, in Martinique, and in French Algeria. But he was but what he's known for are his writings, which are essentially, I mean, you could say that they're political philosophy. He's generally treated as a philosopher. Of course, he's a lot more than that. So Fanon was born in 1925 on the French colony of Martinique, which is in the Caribbean, and is still, by the way, a French occupied colony, right? So it did not achieve independence. It still is. It falls under French territory to this day, which is, I think, an interesting and important point to make. Growing up, Fanon was exposed to the discourse of decolonization, to a very specific discourse of decolonization by Aimé Césaire, who was himself a Martinique sort of philosopher and thinker. And Césaire, the important thing to note there is Césaire's influence on Fanon, came in the form of his way of formulating the terms and conditions under which colonized peoples, Black people in the Caribbean lived, right? And Césaire was particularly interested in the kind of psychology of Blackness. The term that he gives, in his sort of take on what is to be, how African peoples of African descent, how Black people kind of regain their confidence, regain a sense of confidence in the sense that they undo the kind of inferiority complex conditioned into them that is a result of sort of living under the structures of coloniality and being subject to colonial oppression as negritude. Which also involves a kind of reclamation of the term Negro. So Césaire's sort of analytic mostly dealt with
Ahmed, you're muted.
Ahmed, you're muted.
Oh, was I on mute all this time?
No.
Just for a second.
Yeah, the last 5 seconds.
Sorry, where was I?
Just after you gave the definition of negritude.
Okay, so Césaire's, sorry about that. So Césaire's sort of, analytic Césaire starts with an analytic of the colonial sort of state. And what he says is that the colonial state, and this is something that Fanon builds upon in his own work, Césaire is interested in so far as in the colonial state, insofar as it produces the sort of not only the structural conditions of oppression, but a particular kind of psychology. It produces a particular kind of psychology in both colonizers and the colonized. On behalf of colonizers, the argument is that them having power over a population of people leads them to then, enact violence more readily and in more and more explicit forms, right? So, despite all the discourse of civilization that colonizers sort of bring to the table, what actually ends up happening and how sort of like the colonized experience colonization is through sort of brutal violence. So in other words, the colonized, in a way, and he's kind of like, we're kind of pre-shadowing both Fanon and Freire on this, right? Colonizers, in a way, experience a kind of dehumanization, right? And that's not the words that Césaire uses, right? But what he says is that the addiction to power causes a psychological change within you, right? And leads you to commit acts of brutal violence that you can justify under the discourse of civilization. On behalf of the colonized, and specifically Césaire was concerned, with the sort of like the Black peoples of the Caribbean, people of color. it produces a different kind of psychology, which is that the colonized grow up in a state, in a society, inside structures and institutions, are educated within, constantly deal with institutions and with actors, with people, where they are continuously reminded and subjected to a status that is lower, that is inferior, and they begin to interiorize it. So what happens is and Fanon really takes this up, right? This process of interiorization, right, within the psyche of inferiority. And, and Fanon will build on this, and we'll come to that in a little bit, when he begins to talk about the sort of colonizers' tendency to then want to mimic, right, the colonizer, right? So Césaire kind of like takes up, for Césaire, liberation, the first step to liberation, is this, taking up and owning and seeing one's blackness or color not as negative. One of the other things that he notes is that race, the usage of the language of race on behalf of the colonizers, is not some neutral term. It is laden with negative connotation, right? And part of that interiorization of inferiority is in the sense that one begins to see one's color in a negative light, right? And Fanon will also pick up on this and extend it in his own work, right? So Fanon was heavily influenced by Césaire, and to give a little bit of context on his kind of life. During World War II, after in the 1940s, when France fell under occupation from Nazi Germany, the French troops that were stationed in Martinique were stranded there, so they couldn't really leave. And what Fanon began to notice that under this, this occupation, right, which was no longer subject to direct oversight by the French government. The French government itself was under occupation by Germany at the time, right? The soldiers resorted to brutality. So Fanon began to notice that in the absence of any kind of oversight from above, the soldiers, French soldiers implemented a regime of oppression that became overwhelmingly and more brutal over time. And Fanon, after, also took part in the war. He joined the sort of Free French forces and sort of moved to Africa, which was his first landing in Algeria, which is where he wrote his most important works and where his kind of life's work began to unfold later on. His first contact with Algeria was during World War II. So he fought with the French, the Allied forces, and then eventually studied psychiatry in France, and then returned to Martinique for a while to practice psychiatry there, and then eventually moved to French Algeria to work in a hospital and to practice there for a time until after the Algerian War for Independence. So, So the first, and it was in sort of France that, while doing his dissertation, in Black Skin, White Masks, interestingly enough, his dissertation was rejected, which is something that seems to commonly happen to if you write something, as sort of this, like disturbing, at least to colonized sort of mindsets. So, his dissertation was rejected, but he was later able to publish it as a book in 1952. And in Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon kind of unfolds the psychology and the means by which the interiorization of inferiority takes place, right? So a couple of important points before we kind of move on that I'd like to point out about Black Skin, White Masks. We've already talked about sort of Césaire's sort of analytic of the psychology of the native, or the psychology of the colored. But one of the important things that I want to bring up about Fanon is that this kind of internalization due to conditioning, leads to a dual kind of mentality, a fragmented mind on behalf of the colonized, right, or on behalf of the oppressed. Sort of there's terminology. So this dual sort of or this fragmented mind has there's a couple of things going on here. On the one hand, it's not that the colonized don't recognize that they're colonized. They harbor resentment. There's a great resentment, right? So on the one hand, one has to continuously live through and negotiate sort of colonial institutions, colonial knowledge, colonial perceptions of you, right? One has to negotiate one's identity all the time. You're thrown into that position of this constant negotiation, constantly having to justify your existence in the sort of the colonial settler state. And this, what it does is that it on the one hand, it makes the colonized really resentful. It leads to this affective and sort of cognitive arrangement of resentment, right? Where they secretly hate and despise being put into this position, but they feel powerless. They can't really do anything about it. On the other hand, what he also points out is, it then also leads to this tendency. Switch off the. On my phone. It leads to this tendency to also identify with the colonizer's culture and with these sort of social structures and institutions, to be, in other words, to want to be accepted, right, and to want to be rendered equal, right? So there is, and in this, Fanon goes into this sort of these long descriptions of how these complexes develop, whereby people of color sort of begin to want to, they actually internalize this idea that the white people are more civilized than we are, and we want to be more like them, right? And so they then move, to sort of take up, and many of them also, Fanon will sort of point out, become local oppressors in their own right. So they undergo education, white education. They become socially conditioned. They want to acquire more and more social and cultural capital and move about in circles where they will feel like they are more accepted. Of course, Fanon will also say that this is never the case. You never are truly accepted, right? You will always be seen as inferior. But they kind of end up in this, enacting this kind of mimicry, right? And he, the interesting thing, I think, in chapter 6 of Black Skin, White Masks, he has this whole analytic where I think one of the most interesting points in that book is where he talks about how colonization and coloniality condition not only thought, right? It's not just that you borrow social institutions and social practices, ways of doing things, or even ways of thinking things. What's also important to remember is that you borrow ways of desiring. So in other words, desire itself is conditioned. You begin to desire differently. You begin to desire on the terms that the colonizer has set for you, right? So it's not just a coloniality of an institutional or a systemic, an institutional or a programmatic coloniality. It is also a coloniality of thought, and it is a coloniality of desire. It is something that's, like one, I really sort of want to kind of, emphasize that. So even the way that you feel, your emotions themselves have at their roots this kind of like the way that you desire and what you desire is also colonized. So I've taken these, this is a really amazing, I think, quote. Taken from the end of, I've just taken the last couple of pages of Black Skin, White Masks. And so what Fanon sees, as essential is that, the colonized need to undergo this transformation within themselves, where they begin to stop seeing themselves as inferior, and they begin to work on sort of undoing this kind of damage to the psyche, right? and they begin to take pride in their sort of. They see that there is no, as he says, there is no white burden. That they in themselves engender a humanity on their own terms and not on anyone else's terms, right? And so, I just wanted to say those last two lines because I think they're great. He ends the book in an amazing way. His final prayer, which is, "Oh, my body, maketh me always a man who questions, and who questions not only authority and who questions not only colonial institutions and structures, but also questions his or her own thought and his or her own desires," right? So questioning in the sense is much larger than just questioning why do we have particular institutions, why is society structured this way. It is also deeply reflective. It is bent towards a transformation of the self, right? When you start questioning your own way of thinking and your own desires. So that's one thing from the book that I kind of wanted to sort of put out there that I think is important. And then later on, and Fanon was in Algeria. He was practicing as a psychiatrist when the Algerian War for Independence broke out, and French colonial occupation in Algeria had become increasingly brutal over the course of World War II and after. And Fanon kind of saw this as, the way that he frames it in the book, The Wretched of the Earth, which was published in 1961, just a year before he died. He was diagnosed with leukemia. He actually died in early death. He talks about how the French colonizers were beginning to see that things were beginning to slip, right? And so the more you see that things are beginning to slip, the more desperately you want to hold on to them, the more violence you will enact, the more brutal your methods will become, right? In 1945, for example, in Algeria, there was a massacre of thousands of Algerians when they were protesting in the streets in Sétif. This was, I think, it was 1945. In 1956, Fanon resigned. Fanon also, when he was working as a doctor, as a psychiatrist, one of his responsibilities was seeing to a lot of people who had been wounded and people who had developed mental issues. And it was there that he also he was exposed again to violence, both the violent repression outside in the streets and in the violence that he saw in patients that he was working with. In between 56 and 62, his death, he after resigning from the hospital, he devoted himself full time to working and writing for the liberation movements. And then later on, as part of the sort of like nascent Algerian government. And so let's come to The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon doesn't pull any punches. He gets straight to the point, right? He's a very direct. He writes beautifully, but he's a very direct sort of writer. He doesn't mince words, and he starts. The part that I've given you from Wretched of the Earth, which is also the part that I believe has been the most sort of like widely read and influential, popularly, is he starts that off by saying it outright. He says, decolonization, whatever you choose to call it, whatever form it takes, whatever language you use for it, is always a violent phenomenon. It cannot come, for Fanon, decolonization cannot come as a result of, negotiation, building friendly understanding, negotiating with the colonizers. It cannot come as a result of magical practices. It cannot come as some kind of natural shock to the system. It cannot come about as a friendly understanding. Decolonization, as we know it, is a historical process, right? It is a process that is the culmination of a history of violence that has been enacted by colonizers on the people that they sort of displace and govern, right? And it is marked by this dialectic. It is a confrontation between two forces, two peoples that have been historically shaped by violence, and these two peoples are opposed to each other by their very nature, right? There is no room for reconciliation. And so, the key things that I want to kind of, pull out from that chapter is his sort of, defining the colonial world as a Manichaean. Manic by Manichaean basically means a world of black and white, a world of good and evil, right? It is a world that is split in two. It is a world that is defined by spaces and sites that are segregated. Where society is segregated, where people move and live their social everyday, right? Their everyday life is basically means negotiating around a world that is essentially split down the middle, right? And this world is split by the dialectical relation between the colonizer and the colonized, right? And it is a world that is brutal. It is a violent world. Whether it is physical violence or whether it is other forms of violence. Violence for Fanon is structural violence, right? Where society is reshaped and where everyday violences go unsort of acknowledged or even normalized, where we become so normalized to violence, and the excuse that the sort of like colonizers use for this is, they kind of mask this everyday violence and suppression under the guise of an established normative order. This is just the way society is or should be, right? So we should have police and we should have all of these other institutions to keep people in line, right? They'll cite that we need these institutions in society to keep criminals in line, to keep unwanted, sort of people in line. So there is a kind of normalization, of violence within the sort of state. Of course, we can see this. This isn't just, when we think about this, we shouldn't just be thinking about French Algeria, about 80, 90 years ago. We should be thinking about this in the context of our own societies today, right? The extent to which everyday violence has been normalized. The extent to which we have to constantly, and especially people of color, have to constantly negotiate, think through what they're going to do, the way that they're segregated into different sites. So violence is structural and it is normative. It becomes an everyday fact of life. Other forms of violence that he talks about is kind of violence is dependent on this othering, which is the creation of the us-them distinction, which is the way that the distinction, and it's a racial distinction too, between whites and non-whites. This violence is dependent on this idea of the self and the other. And the other, or the them, are dehumanized. The word that Fanon uses for this is that they are seen to be an entirely different species altogether, right? So they're not even in that sense rendered as human. They are rendered as something entirely different. And then there's the whole discourse and the kind of ideologies that support that, right? Where the colonizer uses the words of civilization versus primitivity or barbarism. There's also one of the interesting things about, one of Fanon's interesting observations is that he identifies gaslighting as colonial. So, the colonial state constantly gaslights, the natives or, the colonized. What it does is that it constantly tells them, you guys are violent. We have to keep you in line. We have all of these institutions because you are violent. You aren't civilized. If not kept in line, you will resort to violence, which is why we need this. We need all of these things to keep. We need more police on the streets. We need cordons. We need checks. All right, constant checks and so on and so forth. We need to instill fear in you because otherwise your natural state of being is going to be violent, right? We aren't violent. You're violent. And so we need all of this stuff, right? To keep you, to make sure that we need to civilize you. So you need to go to our schools and you need to be inculcated into our habits and norms and values, right? So that you undo your own violent nature. So violence in itself is essentialized as part of the being of the colonized or the native, right? It's a kind of a gaslighting. The last thing, this dehumanization. I'm trying to stay on time, so maybe I might hurry up a bit. This kind of, so again, this dehumanization is contingent on presenting the native as primitive, lacking values and ethics. making them internalize inferiority through a process of re-education and conditioning, right, which is lifelong. So response, and again, like I put MLK and sort of Malcolm X here. We can discuss this later on. I think it's also interesting to pose people like, for example, Bal Tilak versus Gandhi, right? In the Indian context. Fanon says that there's a couple of other things that happen, right? And this comes out of his work where he observes that certain natives want to go, they kind of internalize and they want to be more civilized, right? So he says that on the one hand, he's very critical of nationalist political parties and institutions that are led by the elite, local elites and intelligentsia, right? He says, all you academics and you members of the intelligentsia, you're all in cahoots with the colonizers, right? Even when they've left. In fact, the colonizers created you guys to maintain a kind of hegemony. I'm using that word from last week, to maintain hegemony in their absence, right? These are people who have been completely interpolated and have completely internalized sort of like, Western ways of desiring and thinking and their knowledge systems and normalized everyday sort of systematic violence and so on and so forth, right? So on the one hand, he's very critical. He says, nothing good, they are not going to liberate you, right? Elites will never liberate. Elites cannot liberate the rest of the people, right? Forget about them. On the other, so, and that, he's very critical where he says, no change. Again, this violence can only be fought with violence in his sort of, no kind of resorting to sort of legal. We need to do due process, right? We need to go through the system. We need to have due process, or we need to humanize the system. We need to reform it, but we can't change it, right? Fanon completely disagrees with all of these things, right? He says the system is inherently violent. It needs to be completely dismantled. You cannot humanize it, you cannot reform it, and you should not give it due process. It is a brutal system that only seeks to reify vertical hierarchies and sort of recreate oppressions. And so he's a critic of, and in the reading that I gave you, he talks about this at length. He criticizes these approaches of nonviolence and compromise and negotiation. Right? To him, these are rooted in interiorization of inferiority and a fear of violence that will upend the social order. One of the other things that he notices is that both local elites as well as the colonizers themselves, right? Whether they're there or abroad, are deeply afraid of violent uprising. They are deeply afraid that the social order will be entirely undone. Right? So they will do anything. They will stoop to compromising even. They will concede. They will give negotiations, right? In an attempt to forego or as you say, put ahead the day when violent insurrection will happen, right? To delay the day. And so eventually, Fanon sort of observes, and this is, I'm kind of pulling out these things also because we're coming to Paulo to prayer in a little bit. What Fanon sees is that decolonization has to be a process of fundamental transformation that is both structural, programmatic, and psychological, right? In his own words, it modifies individuals fundamentally. It transforms spectators who thought of themselves as powerless, right? Spectators crushed with their inessentiality into privileged actors. It gives them power. It, suddenly history's in violent insurrection, the eyes of history are upon you, right? And you gain power that way. The fear of colonizers is suddenly, evoked. And it brings a new natural rhythm into existence, introduced by new men, and with it a new language and a new humanity. So again, one possible way to read this is that any attempt at decolonization that also kind of like has this nostalgia for the past, oh, we used to be like this, let's regain it, is also impossible. what we are effectively creating out of the colonized is new people who see things completely anew and have a new definition of their own humanity that isn't contingent or tied to the definition of humanity foisted upon them from outside. Decolonization is the veritable creation of new men and women. So, those were the kind of key important points that I wanted to sort of talk about in relation to Fanon. And now we come to Freire. Freire also, very interesting and, interesting history too. He was born, he's Brazilian. He was a Brazilian educator and philosopher of education, a lifelong teacher. He was, both Fanon and Freire were deeply influential on me, but I actually read Freire first when I was actually in my first year of teaching. And, it completely changed the way that I thought about teaching and about my career as a teacher. I love his work. So he was born in 1921 in Recife in Brazil. And the important thing to note about Freire's work is that he uses these words of oppressor and oppressed without necessarily, in very concrete and specific terms, saying outright what they are. He does say, however, they can stand for any number of things. So Fanon's discourse in Wretched of the Earth is a very specific. It's about race, it's about colonization, it's about colonizer and colonized, and it's about racialization, right? Freire isn't so much about race, but one thing to note is that Freire was very poor. He grew up very poor when he was young, and I've taken this quote from one of his other texts, which is a collection of letters that he wrote to a colleague. This is from the first letter to Christina. What Freire talks about is when you are poor, when you are working class, when you are hungry, you cannot concentrate on anything else. All you can concentrate on is day-to-day survival, day-to-day subsistence. So Freire's sort of critique is both a critique of colonization, but it's also a heavy critique of class structures and vertical hierarchies, right? And, I've taken this quote from his other texts. Many times with no means to resist, I felt defeated by hunger while doing my homework. Sometimes I would fall asleep leaning on the table where I was studying as if I had been drugged. I was removed from the educational experience in which students and readers become aware that they are also producers of knowledge, in which authors do not simply deposit comprehension of their texts into students. One of the things that Freire talks about and really critiques heavily in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, first of all, he says, is that those who are hungry and constantly struggling for their everyday subsistence, living day to day, they don't know where their next meal is going to come from, or they are always hungry. Their meals are not enough to satisfy them, right? They will always be, that will always be first priority for them, right? They will not be able to concentrate. Any efforts to educate the hungry are always going to meet with degrees of failure because, and he sort of talks about it in a psychological light. You literally cannot concentrate when you are hungry, right? So a lot of Freire's work talks about the psychology of being poor, of poverty, the psychology of poverty and what that does to you. The other thing is his critique of education. Now, for Freire, and it's the one thing I'd like to say is that eventually Freire's family was able to be upwardly mobile, and he eventually did go on to study philosophy and law, and eventually, and then became a teacher, and eventually he had several directing positions in the Department of Education and Culture in various states in Brazil. And also, as his theories of education began to gain more international popularity, Freire began to travel to other countries, including the United States, where he brought his idea of critical pedagogy. You have modern day education scholars like Henry Giroux, who've been deeply influenced by him, in his theories of education. So the other thing that he really criticizes is that education, particularly particularly public education, right? The rich schools where the elite kids go to, the rich kids go to, they don't suffer from this to a great extent, right? But especially education for the working and the middle class, public education has a huge problem with it. He calls it the banking system of education, right? He writes about this, a big chunk of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, not the part that I gave you guys is him talking about this, right? Where he says that the problem with public education, that isn't for rich kids is that it doesn't, it's a highly political, like the first thing he has to say about education is no educational paradigm, no curriculum, no educational structure, institutional structure, etc., is neutral. It is always political. Education is always political. Education either seeks to reify a status quo, an existing structure, or it seeks to break the chain or the cycle. It is either reification or emancipation, right? So no education system is apolitical. The other thing that he has to say is that the problem with education is that it is based on these ideas of rote memorization. Education, the problem with education is that it is all about, this idea that, it's not about reflection. It's not about gaining a critical reflexivity. It is not about gaining a kind of critical understanding of and relation to the world. Fundamentally, education is not about transforming the world. It is about, his critique is that it is about foisting knowledge with this underlying idea that, your minds are supposed to be like a bank where you store things, right? And it is about degrees. It is about getting qualifications to fit into a pre-specified role in society, right? It is about memorization. It is about rote learning. It's not about kind of creating critical distance so that one can transform the world or be empowered to transform the world. And he has a lot, to say about that model, the banking model of education, right? Which is education under capitalism, especially public education under capitalism. I mean, part of the reason why Freire also spoke to me was that is exactly the model that I grew up sort of under, right? So anyone who's kind of been through that kind of education system can kind of relate to this. The modern capital. So a couple of points again. I'm gonna try and cap this in another like five or 10 minutes or so. The modern capitalist world is marked by class division and strife, and there is a dialectic. Again, this is where him and Fanon kind of come together. For them, the modern world system is inherently brutal and violent, and is marked by dialectics and binaries, right? The oppressors. Now, Freire has a lot to say about oppressors, right? Whether those are local elites or whether those are foreigners. But he has a lot, particularly, and also, because he's coming from Brazil, and he's speaking after Brazil became independent, he says that what happens is that we're in a place right now where a lot of quote unquote developing countries, local elites, having been oppressed and subject to histories of oppression, become oppressors themselves. So they internalize oppression, but the way that they internalize oppression is, and they want to mimic, they become oppressors in their own right. They say, now we have money and now we have power, so now we are going to lord it over the rest of the others, right? They begin to see themselves as different from the other natives, from the other locals. And so they continue the cycle of dehumanization and oppression through systematic and systemic violence. Now, the two important things that speaks to the psychology of oppressors is that they tend to think of humanity as something that is had. They tend to think of liberation actually, and of freedom and of emancipation as engendered in having things. So I have more money. That, for me, liberation or freedom means having more money, having better social status, having better cultural capital, having more things, right? Having more material things, having more power, having the power to, tell people what to do and what to say and how to think, right? So this notion of having, right, and having more, and they say that, the way that oppressors usually sort of constitute this is that they constitute this as a right, right? the right in any free society, democratic society, it is our right to be able to accumulate capital and wealth and move upwards. So social mobility becomes this kind of reification of the turning of the wheel, to use a kind of Buddhist term, right? The wheel continues to sort of turn, and the cycle is never broken. And so even one's humanity, they eventually come to it. Also, the other thing to remember, and we'll come back to this when we look at subaltern studies and talk about Gayatri Spivak and Ranajit Guha in the later classes, is that in most cases, elites who have the benefit of better education and more capital and all of that also begin to see themselves as, we have more humanity. We can speak for the others. We are the voice of the masses. We know what's best for everyone. We see ourselves as more humane, right? We need to run education schemes to educate the others along the lines that we were educated, right? And so to them, humanity is also therefore a thing that one has, right? And the exercise of one's rights becomes contingent on the oppression of others. This is a kind of sadistic love, as Freire calls it, which is a kind of perverted love, a love of death and not life. It's not a liberatory kind of love. And this is where Fanon and kind of Freire, they kind of slightly diverge. And I think where the discussion for today will become really good to have. For Freire, liberation entails, as for Fanon, both agree on this, there needs to be a complete and total restructuring of the social order and of social reality. It involves a change in both oppressor and oppressed. Both of them agree on this, right? However, the way that this happens for Freire is through education. The way that we educate, teachers are very important. The way that we need to educate and the terms in which we educate and what we educate, what needs to change. There are two steps to this that he outlines in the chapter that I gave you. The first is that, and this education and this transformation through education cannot come from the oppressors. It cannot come from elites. They're too far gone. They're too indebted to the system that they have. It has to come from below, right? And the way that it has to happen is that education for the people from below needs to change. The oppressed change. Education needs to be emancipatory. It needs to create a critical reflexivity within the masses of people so that they can unveil and articulate the precise structures of oppression, right, to which they are subject. So the violence that has become normalized for them, that they've gotten used to, they need to be able to critically unveil it and call it out, right? And commit themselves to its transformation. So they need to start having discussions, discourses need to flow about how they can transform their own conditions, right? And then, the way that the oppressors, when the oppressors realize that their emancipation too lies with the emancipation of the oppressed, right? So this entails a kind of critical self-reflexivity in amongst elites and amongst oppressors themselves, where they realize that the system needs to change. It's a violent system for all and everyone. These structures are not good for rich and poor alike. When they begin to realize that freedom means freedom for all, and that is when they can join the fight for liberation, right? When they realize that it's not the people you have power over who are violent. It is you who create violence, right? And violence begets violence. So the violence of the oppressed is a reaction to the violence of the oppressors, right? The violence of the oppressors came first, right? When they realize that the cycle needs broken, then they can join the oppressed in their struggle, but the oppressed need to lead. The oppressors cannot lead, right? You need to let the oppressed lead. Otherwise, the oppressors are just taking over and appropriating and co-opting the struggle, right? And so the work of education, Freire developed a whole philosophy of education that was fundamental to this process of educating. And creating self-reflection and self-understanding and self-transformation. This is what good education can do for people, right? Education should free people. It should unveil reality, both social external reality and internal reality as well, right? External and internal reality. It should wake you up to both. It should wake you, again, and this is where he agrees with Fanon. It involves a transformation in becoming new. It involves a transformation where you begin to question your own thoughts and desires and the reality that is external to you. And but for Freire, this can happen through education. It does not, I mean, not through violence, not through some uprising or insurrection, but through education, which might eventually lead to an overthrow of the order. But education comes takes precedence, right? And so just end with this quote, and we can open it up for discussion then, that it is only the oppressed who by freeing themselves can free their oppressors as well, right? So for Freire, liberation is an act of love. He mentions that word again and again throughout the book. It has to be done as an act of commitment, as an act of love, and also as an act of sacrifice. This is something where he and Fanon disagree. Fanon sees sacrifice is not really necessary, but Freire does. The latter as an oppressive class can free neither others nor themselves. It is therefore essential that the oppressed wage the struggle to resolve the contradiction in which they are caught, and the contradiction will be resolved by the appearance of the new man, neither oppressor nor oppressed. So we have to transcend and think beyond these two categories too. The liberated person is man in the process or woman in the process of liberation. Political action on the side of the oppressed must be pedagogical action in the authentic sense of the word, and therefore action with the oppressed, right? And so that's the presentation for today. I'm just going to stop there because we're already over time, and I'd like to open it up to discussion. So two views. The other two readings that I've given. So W. Du Bois, kind of also doubles down on the part that I gave you is about his experience of Blackness in the United States. Ashish Nandi, the Indian, political sort of scholar, writes about violence in the context of development and globalization. And we'll have a lot to say about development. The reason I kind of put it as a secondary reading is we'll have a lot to say about violence as enacted in modern day development and globalization later. But I wanted to sort of contrast these two personalities, Fanon and Freire. And they're kind of essential figures too in decolonial and post-colonial discourse. So yes, observations, comments, questions. Powerful stuff, right? And they don't both of them don't pull any punches.
To me, it was very interesting to see, you have the boot of wandering Fanon. There's this whole history of violence, and even though violence is not apparent right now because of the institutionalized, it's still being exerted, but we don't really feel it, but it's still there. So it made to me a lot of sense that there's just this boot on people's faces, and you need to fight that violence with some sort of violence, because otherwise there's this like overpowering over you. And I seen that this historical sense gave me a lot of understanding of our conditions right now. I found that very interesting.
Thank you. Yes. And Freire especially talks about this, right? Where he says that the oppressors or the colonizers or those who have power, what they have to realize is that actually they're in the process of dehumanizing others. They are also, it's yourself, actually. You becoming human, right? So it's waking up to the idea that you are inherently violent in order to, that you are violent in order to enact violence. So I have some hands up here. Is Sissy or I'm not sure. Sorry.
Can you hear me, Ahmed?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That was, a feat. To really bring these two theorist thinkers into nutshells. I'm wondering whether we should trouble, especially Freire's historical determinism, if you will. So in the way that you've presented the chapter, and also, in fact, inherent in his emancipatory theory, there is something that reminds me of Marx in the 18th Brumaire. So first, a historical determinism and how the masses has been somewhat homogenized, right? So there is a consciousness raising that needs to happen first. And the question is how then the role of the teacher and the educator, no matter how self-conscious and reflexive and have the best intent in mind and the educational systems in which we are actually valorizing particular kinds of language. So first, two conceptual considerations, one about historical determinism and the order, and therefore the process and the frameworks through which we then a condition for emancipation.
To all the questions. I mean, I do have two observations to your points, and we can actually open this up as a discussion. Those are great points, great questions to ask. So with regards to Marx, and I'll respond with reference to both Fanon and Freire, because both were actually influenced by Marx, but they also have a critique, and actually Fanon makes this critique too, in his work, where. So there's two things, I think. The first is that Marx's treatment of, for example, race, right? Marx's distinction between the superstructure and the base, right? He relegates race to the realm of ideology. So for Marx, ideology, all of these racism, sexism, all of these things are discursive and ideological, right? In nature, they belong to the superstructure. But the fundamental sort of conditions that Marx, the grounds upon which emancipation for Marx happens is transformation of base, right? In transformation in the modes of production. And I think Fanon really both of these writers would take that to task. Fanon particularly does this, where he says, and he actually shows this, where he shows that the coloniality of peace are not something that are foisted from above and not purely ideological and discursive. They are structural, they are fundamental, they are material, right? They are both a part of both base and superstructure. And so Fanon, and I think mostly like a decolonial sort of criticism of Marx would take that into account, right? And in doing so would also kind of be a kind of indirect critique of and historical determinism in Marx, because socioeconomic and political structures are contingent upon specific historical circumstances, situations, but also they emerge out of a particular set of relations. There is nothing fixed or deterministic about them from a decolonial standpoint, right? You can the idea that society is made and imagined and artificial, and that there could be structures otherwise, and that there is no neat succession of structures, right? And the Brazilian, if you wanted another sort of theorist to sort of look at, the Brazilian political philosopher and economist Roberto Unger talks about this, right? When he talks about, with respect to the social sciences, right? which he also does this critique that the social sciences have kind of forgotten their initial premise, which Marx really understood well, related slightly ignoring a few things, which was that social structures are not, are imaginary structures eventually, right, at their roots, and they can be imagined otherwise. I don't know if that completely answers your question, but it's a starting point, right? And I'm sure other people here would have to add to that. So that was the first. I'm sorry, what was your second question?
Yeah, a great point and reminder about historical determinism. I suppose at the point where the structures themselves have been arranged, right, then there seems to be a particular sort of linearity of process that is, right, something needs to happen first before other things. And it's just something that I've been struggling with for a long time as a political theorist, just that what is outside of the social contract model, right? So even if we take Rousseau and we need a legislator to even just, to contract with each other. And of course, then all the liberal stuff comes and we can reject that. But it seems like in every solution to the issue of deep structural issues within social, economic, political settings, that there needs to be that big aromantic light, right? That is inward, that shines kind of outward in order to identify that this is the pivot point, etc. So the question is, if it comes from the masses, how from? And how do the ways in which these theorists, mostly male,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah. So there is the politics of that, I suppose.
So, and I'm going to be very quick because there's other people with their hands raised, and I do want to give everyone room and time to speak. Very quickly, the problem, and you can read Unger for his critique of political theory and economics, and he does a more general critique of the social sciences, right? This idea that there are a finite set of social structures that are contingent upon certain things, right? Like the idea that their social contract needs to exist is not true. Decolonial theory actually disproves this. Later on in the sessions and subsequent sessions, we'll actually look at this, but throughout history in multiple societies all around the world, there have been structures that have coexisted in parallel. There have been structures that are nothing like the structures that we think and have normalized as the finite set of structures today. I'm trying to be very short on that, right, and concise in my reply, but I can also post a link or two for you, or I might actually put it up on the website for you to go and look at. The other is, that's an interesting question, right? Which is, there's this question of what is the role of the teacher and what is the agency and what is their kind of relation to the math, right? I will postpone that question because maybe other people will have, we have a lot of teachers, we have a lot of students in the room. I would like to give people time to speak. So Christina and then Maya.
Thanks, Ahmed. I have spent 20 years educating a deconstruction of the narratives of design history from that social evolutionism. I realized this week that I think deconstruction is not enough. It's critique. It's internal to the system. And what we have to do is reconstruct and overthrow that whole narrative. And I wondered if you could speak to that from your thoughts on that subject.
We're going to spend a lot of time talking about design history and history in general. In the subsequent sessions too. Very quickly, it's thinking of the work of history, whether it's design history or art history or any kind of, historical narrative. About not even configuration or rearrangement or rethinking sort of institutional and programmatic, the academy, right? The academy as the site within which historization takes place. So history is not made academy. History is constantly being in historical narratives and historicization is constantly being done in sites other than the academy. So we need to first of all stop situating the academy as the sole site of knowledge production. It's not even history, it's knowledge production, right? that's the first thing. The second thing is, the second point that I have to say is, what is the point of history if not for us to develop a conscious relation to it, and through it to our present and future reality, to our present reality and our speculation and materialization of futures. So we need history, in other words, needs to be, in the sense that Freire talks about this, history, the study of history needs to be emancipatory. It should stop being history as history is. It needs to be history with the intent to engender a new relation to reality and the possibility, through the understanding of historical structures and events and situations and transitions, the opening up of the new. Otherwise, there's no point. So so just very quickly to your points, two responses. We have Maya.
Thanks, Ahmed. So just actually to pick up on that point that you made about the academy, I think I'm responding to Sissy's question and comment at the beginning. One thing that, and so I'm kind of responding as somebody who is an academic sort of later in my life, but has spent about more than 20 years in activist movements and as a researcher outside the academy and in feminist movements in India, that Paulo Freire has been very influential to a lot of people who have taught me in movements and sort of where I've come from. And so it's the first time I'm actually reading his work from a different perspective or a different lens. So I find it really interesting to suddenly revisit Freire after so many years. But I think my understanding is that as activists, as cultural workers, as students, as teachers, I think these texts, are rooted in time, but to also respond to this point that you made about, sort of history or a historical sense being emancipatory, I think these are invitations and provocations to our own practice now. And I think that, especially with people like Freire, I think, maybe less with Fanon, but I'm less familiar with his work. I think someone like Freire has been so influential to praxis and making and doing, that I think that I really see his work in particular as like really fantastic provocations to say, what kind of teacher do you want to be? And I know that some of the people who have taught me have not had sort of formal educations, but have been really incredible in talking about politics and emancipation and change through methods and methodologies inspired by his writing and his work. So I think that that's just my sort of takeaway from this, and also this question of sort of like history and doing and the academy, and the fact these texts have been influential outside the academy as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, Christina, right? The point of when we read any thinker, whether it's Fanon or Freire or Blood or Solo or anyone, really, the point. Yes, every writer situates themselves and is writing from their particular time and place and their background. I think, but again, for us, reading and education in general is a hermeneutic, right? It's a kind of relation where it's a kind of like a conversation, and it's you standing in your own time and place and with your own background and your own perspective and view on the world, engaging in a kind of conversation with thinkers. And in that sense, and that's precisely, I think, one of the important lessons that I think Freire has for us is precisely that is the way that is the kind of stance or the kind of way through which one should engage, right? It's about sort of a dialogue and a conversation with the text that you are engaging with, while at the same time there's a kind of double there are multiple levels of reflexivity, actually, not even a double reflexivity, right? Because you're reflecting situated in your own space and time and with your own background and history. You're also reflecting on their space and time and their sort of background and history. And then there's a kind of space in between, which is, texts kind of speak from the past to the future, which is also our present today. So there's kind of multiple kind of discourses cycles happening there. I did want to, one thing I was wondering, like, if people had any thoughts on there's also like a discussion going on in the chat around, I think two things that I wanted to kind of throw out there was, Fanon believes fundamentally that no change can happen without violence. Violence needs to be met with violence. There needs to be an overthrow, and that only through violence can people gain, the colonized can gain a new sense of themselves and begin to build a new. The entire system has to be dismantled, but the way that it'll be dismantled, like, you can't dismantle the system by negotiating, or, it has to be an overthrow. Whereas, Freire doesn't negate the idea of violence, but for him, the more important thing is this kind of transformation. Like, for Freire, the transformation happens before and is a prerequisite to what may happen after, whether it's systemic overthrow or whatever. And for Fanon, the transformation comes as a result of the struggle. So I think that's an important thing, and I'm wondering what people have comparing those two thinkers together. And then in the chat, I believe there's a long conversation going on about, and a very interesting one, about whether it is on the oppressed or the colonized to free both oppressors and oppressed, right? Whether it should come, and this is, we can find this in arguments around social justice, and we can find this in the present discourses, right? Like, why do people of color have to constantly have the burden on them of educating white people, for example, right? And I'm wondering, like, if people have any reflections or thoughts on that. Sanjar?
Yes, hi everyone, can you hear me? Yes, I was, it's a very relevant question to me. I was struggling to reconcile these two viewpoints of what dismantlement means and whether it necessitates violence, and then the role of education. And one of the ways I'm originally from Central Asia, which is a region that also went through multiple periods of colonialism. And one of the examples I wanted to share that actually helps me reconcile those two viewpoints is the late 19th century, early 20th century Jadid movement, which was a movement of arguably intellectuals and elites who were advocating for completely new schools to be established in Central Asia and regions of Tatarstan. And their argument was that we need to teach these new skills, these new kinds of knowledges, because at the time there were mostly madrasas that taught in different ways. And their argument was, unless we teach our new generation these new skills, including the Russian language and other languages and other knowledges, there is no way we can liberate ourselves. So on the one hand, it does seem like a Fanonian argument that, the kinds of things you desire in your refrain, like, oh, you need the Russian language to be civilized. But on the other hand, you can also see it as an attempt of dismantlement of a kind of a colonial mentality that just kind of gives up and doesn't think about the ways they can resist the powers of colonialism, in that case, Russian Empire, in ways other than armed struggle. In which case, wasn't an option for majority of the population, because they were mostly land workers, like farmers. And then in the end, when the Soviets came to power, or the Bolsheviks came to power, it was the Jadid movement was such a threat that they purged all of them, all of these writers and educators and playwrights. They were all executed. So that at least suggests that kind of dismantlement is threatening to the colonial power in some way, even if it's not directly violent.
I mean, to that, I'll also add, and thank you, in the chat for also suggesting other works. So, for example, something to add is, and this is kind of like on Freire's sort of perspective, like the importance that he places on education, right? On pedagogy. I wouldn't even call it education, because education, again, there's the danger of treating that term too narrowly, right? Like education is what you get in a school or a university. It's institutional and it's formal, right? I think the word pedagogy is a much better term to employ. I mean, what both Freire and Fanon are kind of talking about when they're talking about transformation is decolonization on another level, which is, and we'll talk about this later on when we come to Quijano and Gras-Faguel, epistemic decolonization, which is delinking and unentangling oneself from the kind of genealogy of thought that the West brought with it. So it's it starts with, and there are examples of this, if I were to add examples of this, like Mahmoud Mamdani's written about the experiments that were done in Africa, establishing universities that had the aim of epistemic decolonization. He also talks about their failure, and their failure is primarily put on the fact that the whole idea of epistemic decolonization was still situated within the site of the university and subject to its structures and paradigms, right? So there have been attempts at this. Not many have succeeded. And there are other questions, which is, how does one attempt epistemic decolonization? It's easier for some communities and societies and cultures than others, right? There is the danger of falling into a romanticization of the past and sort of flattening out of local oppressions. I mean, the best example that I can give of this is, is in the case of the Indian subcontinent, where the kinds of issues that you see that are caste-based, like that are endemic to pre-colonial ontologies, are much more substantial, right? As politically, it's a difficult question. Any other? Margot has do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I wanted to know, because you kind of started to talk about it, that the oppressor needs to leave, otherwise he will reappropriate your dialectic and language against you. And that's something we see a lot. Like you mentioned the Battle of Alger. The Battle of Alger was used after as a guide, as training for oppression. Like it was used after in Argentina in the 70s as a training of anti-guerrilla and torture. Even though it was an emancipating piece of art originally, it was used by the oppressor after. And have you seen something in Fanon or that could explain how you do when oppressor just appropriate your language or your cultural resistance against you?
So, I mean, it's a great question. I think if I were to reframe that question slightly, and we'll deal with this question again in subsequent, but again, all these classes kind of also tie together, right? All of these people are raising the same questions in slightly different ways. It's this question of, so I'll pick up on your point about language, which is, can we articulate a different conception of the world in the colonizer's language? Because if language is ontology or ontologizing, then there it raises this real problem of, can you think of ontologies other when you are beholden to and trapped within the language, and with language the sort of ontoepistemological, the categories of language and the categories of knowledge and knowing that are foreign to you. Nico.
Hi there. I think you alluded earlier on to the relationship of Fanon and Gandhi, and I'm very familiar with the Indian independence movement, and I wondered if you could just briefly contrast, obviously, the non-violence that Gandhi advocated and Fanon's insistence on violence. And as a sort of sub-question, I wonder how you would apply particularly, well, I guess both Fanon and Freire's thinking to South Africa, which was colonized in a way, but obviously more sort of internally colonized, and how one argue that the Black majority government has taken on characteristics of becoming an oppressor in the way that Fanon characterized the kind of bourgeoisie of national bourgeoisies becoming oppressors.
Yeah, so thank you for those. Quick things, and this is my own, again, other people will probably have different reads on this. My read on Gandhi, and it wasn't just Gandhi, I mean, there are several actually different views on nonviolence. The two contrasting ones I'm most interested in with regards to my own work are not only Gandhi's view on nonviolence, but also Ambedkar's, right? B.R. Ambedkar's. Who are, you have two actually opposing views on nonviolence within both of those two sort of thinkers and activists. Ambedkar's kind of so Gandhi's draws from like a sort of, both draw from like specific interpretations, historical interpretations of a South Asian, the ontology of ahimsa, right? And that's where I read them as differing from Fanon's sort of like rhetoric of nonviolence. For both Gandhi and Ambedkar, they're drawn local sort of cosmological and local sort of conceptual. Gandhi leans heavily on a traditional Vedic Brahman. Ambedkar leans on a Buddhist understanding of ahimsa. Right, so I think that's what, and it's. I mean, this is a discussion to be had. It's an interesting discussion, right? Whether, like, ahimsa as a concept is not just nonviolence. It is part of. It is a kind of what you would call stance towards reality and life. That entails not only, it entails nonviolence only in the sense of negation, I will not harm, but also in the sense of I value and I understand the sort of codependent and co-entangled nature of life, right? So there are certain sort of cosmological and sort of like there are certain foundations on which they are building out their sort of conceptions of nonviolence, on which they then base the freedom struggle in the Indian subcontinent. Fanon, of course, is not reading nonviolence that way. He doesn't place it within a specific historical, cultural, or as a cosmological category. He is reading it in this kind of very pragmatic way, right? He reads it together with nonviolence as a response to violence, right? And a response by a very specific set of people, right? And he terms it as a response that is driven by fear and driven by an imperative or an urge to delay. So nonviolence is the delaying or the deferment of violence. The continuous deferment of violence. To use a sort of Derridian sort of phrase. It is constantly deferring. The other, I mean, with the South African problem, and again, like my sort of area expertise lies less in I can speak to it less better than I can to the South Asian context. It's a real, I mean, isn't this the issue that all people who come to power kind of face? Which, I mean, it's a good question to pose, right? Which is, let me put it another way. Freire emphasizes educating, public education and the education of the masses, right? Quote unquote, the masses. I don't particularly like that term, actually. But what you're suggesting is something different, which is we need to educate the elite. You know, we need to educate those in power differently. And they need to be educated in a way that, in such a way that they can engender a different kind of relation to the people that they are, well, in charge of now, but what other relation can we think of? I don't know if that's quite clear.
I mean, there was an argument during the time of the struggle that whether you needed, there was kind of two-stage revolution theory that you needed to replace the one ruling class, and then you needed to struggle for, a socialist revolution, which I think was the South African Communist Party's strategy, which is the kind of national revolution strategy, which has, obviously been a common pattern. I mean, we haven't really talked about the role of capitalism per se or imperialism in this lecture, but I mean, crudely you could say that the black majority rule has replaced the faces of the capitalist class in South Africa, and necessarily there will be whatever violence is associated with that system, because it wasn't a kind of thoroughgoing revolution. I mean, whether it's a question of education or not, I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure it's a question of whether educating the elites would have made a difference. As happens, I think that probably the South African revolutionary elites were pretty well educated, but have still ended up, at least in my view, betraying the black majority in South Africa.
Yeah, but at the same time, I don't think, I mean, again, and this is something that both Fanon and Freire will say, right? Like, you cannot disentangle the oppression of local elites from their historical moorings. I mean, the elites borrow effectively their structures and modes from colonial history and are shaped by it, right? The other thing is, again, if we read it in a sort of macro lens, what is happening in South Africa, or for that matter, what is happening in Pakistan, or what is happening in any other part of the world where local elites oppress the sort of masses. Again, we have to read this as coloniality is a global, systemic, structural phenomena that continues to persist. This is where I'm kind of drawing the distinction between decolonization and colonization and decolonization, coloniality and decoloniality. We'll come to that, I mean, when we in subsequent sessions, but the coloniality of power is Anglo-Eurocentric, right? I mean, the counter to that would be that decolonization would involve sort of like coming to grips with the coloniality of power and how local elites will have to sort of like come to grips with the ways that they've been molded, right? To sort of reify and reinforce structures of coloniality, as well as structures that were introduced during colonialism, right? Again, it's, at least in my mind, it is about rethinking these structures, delinking from the sort of the modern colonial world system, as well as from the coloniality of power.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the lecture as well and what you've put together here.
Shreyasi?
Yeah. So my question is in context of Gandhi. Can we really decolonize with respect to design, having Gandhi on board?
My views on Gandhi, I don't have a very positive view of Gandhi. I mean, I know this is going on in the chat as well, I see. I mean, I agree. Gandhi is, set up to be a hero in the West. He's not actually he's a very conservative figure when it comes to the Indian subcontinent, particularly when it comes to caste, right? And you're right, Gandhi and Savarkar are both, so the narrative there, and it's interesting, I've just recently written on this, the Hindutva and Hinduism, and I said this in the last week's session as well. These are 19th century constructions. They are artificial constructs that were basically created between the British and complicit local elites, of whom Savarkar and Gandhi were both part of. So Gandhi himself was quite racist, actually. There's accounts of his time in South Africa. So again, I kind of lost your question there. Gandhi in relation to design. The thing is, Gandhi's philosophy has to be read at many levels, right? What Gandhi is Gandhi advocates for a really successful practice of nonviolence in the political sense, right? And of course was himself very successful as a political leader at organizing and managing and sort of running a movement based on nonviolence. The philosophy of ahimsa or nonviolence must be read on two levels, though, right? So Apoornan Jha at JNU, at Jawaharlal Nehru University, has sort of talked about one of these levels very well, which is that nonviolence, and there's a great video of him where he's comparing Gandhi and Kabir, which I think is an unfair comparison. Kabir was a saint. It's unfair to compare saints to mortal men. But one of the things that Jha is clear is that the Gandhian nonviolence does allow for it, which is it allows for people, and I'm going to put this into English because when you are hungry, when you are struggling for day-to-day subsistence, right, which was the majority of people in India, still is, it is difficult for you to take part in an armed revolutionary struggle that is sustained and committed, right? This is Jha's argument. Again, you can challenge it. And his reading of Gandhi. Gandhi allows, is for people who otherwise would not be able to take part in a struggle of civil disobedience, right? And it allows for, what's really interesting about his analysis is that it allows for this on multiple levels, not only on the pragmatic level of I can participate in a nonviolent protest, but also the psychological, on the psychological sort of, so he does this kind of reading on many levels. So that's one thing. I mean, I think, kind of arguing for Gandhi, but now arguing against Gandhi, the problem is that Gandhi's view of self-rule, Swaraj, and of the state is based on a Brahminical. It's a primarily Vedic Brahminical reifying the caste system as a kind of natural order. The natural order of things. It's not critical. It's a conservative view, right? It is a view that inherently privileges and sets up local Indian elites and continues to perpetuate the caste hierarchy, the Varna system, right? And of course, we can see in India today that this has led to problems in the Indian subcontinent persist because of this, between faiths, between Hindus and Muslims, between the very different castes and those who are not of caste, the Dalits. So Gandhi, in that sense, one must be very critical of Gandhi.
So I'm based out of Gujarat. I'll be finishing my education there. So, and the Sabarmati Ashram and all of these Gandhi shrines, quote unquote shrines, are over there in Gujarat. And the institution where I study recently, I guess 2 years back, had this international open elective, and the theme was Gandhi. And that's nuts. I mean, that is the kind of obsession everyone has with Gandhi. And ultimately, it is, Brahmins or the Brahminical system that Gandhi perpetuated, or rather stood for, are the ones running all of these programs, these institutions. And most importantly, like, it is Brahminical cultural hegemony. It doesn't benefit anyone, absolutely no one. And there is absolutely no mention of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar anywhere.
That's not entirely true. But again, this is why the study of history, is so important. One must really study history in detail. The history of Hinduism in the Indian subcontinent is a very complex one. One reading that one must always do is at what points in history does it behoove and become advantageous to a class that had prior and continue to enjoy privileges even under colonial rule. The Indian subcontinent is a great sort of like case study of this, right? Because what you find, and it's not just Hindu elites or what would become Hindu elites, it's also Muslim elites have the same problem.
The Ashrafs.
I have a lot to say about the creation of Pakistan, about, with regards to this partition, well, I'm not going to talk about partition, but, the one needs to sort of read, Romola Thapar, who's a historian at JNU, has written some great sort of like histories this way, right? Like critical histories. One has to read these histories critically, right? Modern institutions, modern structures, the modern colonial state is, in the Indian subcontinent especially, is the outcome of complicity between elites who had historically enjoyed privilege as well as better, all the other privileges that come with it, right? Through it. These are privileges that Muslim and Hindu elites and other elites had enjoyed for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And the struggle for independence and decolonization cannot be read independently of the interests of these groups and their complicity with the colonial British in enacting and reifying certain structures that continue and certain arrangements that continue to this day. So I think, one must sort of always look at these kinds of details.
Okay, thank you.
There's another, I'm sorry, I'm also switching between the chat. And what's this about cancel culture? Canceling Gandhi. No, but one needs to always read, again, like I said, there are readings of Gandhi's ahimsa or nonviolence that are productive. And there are readings that are not. One always has to kind of do these kinds of multiple readings, right? It's not about canceling someone. It's about like extracting, at least, and again, people can disagree, but one must always kind of read these. It's perfectly fine, in my opinion, to hold two opinions that are contradictory in one's head about something, right? So we can read Gandhian nonviolence in a productive manner while at the same time acknowledging that Gandhi as a figure was also problematic, and very conservative and fallible. Yeah, no, I get sorry, I'm also, I can't switch between the chat and sorry. Yeah. So we're also almost on time. Any last comments or observations or anything?
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not able to raise my hand because I'm a co-host, so I'm just gonna speak up here. Building up on the previous comments about how designers, especially, we have also been educated within these elite institutions who have certain ideas of how we should go forward with our practice, and we're also being educated within this Eurocentric idea of design education. And then if you want to do sort of social design or projects which are beneficial for the disadvantaged, then we sort of create that the same sort of cycle where we feel like we know what's the best thing to do, and we go back in and we sort of engage them. And oftentimes this idea of engaging them or co-design sessions or participatory design is the idea of sort of including them in the process, but they can often be symbolic as well. So sort of my question is that if as designers we want to be more self-reflective and critical about our own roles in perpetuating these power imbalances and sort of try and practice design in a different way and engage with communities such that we allow them so that they can create their own conditions to sort of break out of this situation that they're in. How can we do that? And especially as a systemic designer, how can I sort of, or how can we rethink our own positions and negotiate that power between us?
That's an ongoing question for this whole series, right, of lectures. And it's actually, I mean, I'm also very wary of giving answers in this way because, the point of these sessions is to also allow for you to come up with your own sort of like, I don't want to be the person who tells people what to do with regards to design. I mean, one thing that I would say as a systemic designer is one useful thing to think about in particular relation to today's lecture. And we'll come back to systems in many ways. I mean, we were talking about world systems last week, and I would throw another question at you, which is to think about, which is, according to both of these thinkers, modern systems are predicated on violence and function through violence. Now, what does that do for systemic design? How does one, to use Freire's language, unveil violence and articulate violence in systemic design? Designers have all these methods for drawing these complex diagrams of systems, but they never quite do this work. Vaidehi?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to read back like the reflection I had earlier on chat, which was just around like these readings reveal a factor of like violence that comes from, I believe, like a masculine energy of violence or like change. And I'm curious to know what like a feminist perspective would entail. And again, it's less of a question, more like a reflection, as well as like just a thought that I wanted to put out there. Like, and it could be like anyone could just like answer, whoever. But, yeah.
No, definitely. I think, I'm, see that people are already responding in the chat. Yes. And we will look at, I mean, we have one session on sort of gender and sex and sexuality, including two perspectives from feminist scholars working from the global south. So we'll eventually come around to that. All right, my voice is giving out. So with that, we're above time today. If no one has any final observations or comments, I mean, thank you all for coming, and attending the session. I mean, I think you should be able to say the chat, I think, and I put in some links there too. And if you have an audio recording, if someone could send that, I could put that up for the lecture, and I'll have the slides up by tomorrow as well on the website. Maybe I'll put in a few other like links to readings that you guys might want to go through related to this week's stuff. And then, yeah, next week, I'll see you guys next week. Okay, bye everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.